There are a number of events in the seerah which indicate the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ's mission and that show you he was similar to the biblical prophets. He was one of them. An example of such an event is the fact that he was foretold and fulfilled the predictions of astrologers and soothsayers. We're going to look at that today, and inshallah in the upcoming videos we'll look at some other examples as well. One example of someone who foresaw the Prophet ﷺ's rise through astrology is Heraclius, the king of Rome, and this is attested to not only in Muslim sources but also in early non-Muslim sources. I'm going to show you that today. I'm going to show you another couple of people who also foresaw his rise through astrology according to the seerah. Now, the fulfillment of astrological predictions is supernatural. The fact that before his rise, ﷺ, you had a number of these astrologers and soothsayers foreseeing his coming is also supernatural and shows you they knew something very important was about to happen. And it also parallels the stories of Moses, peace be upon him, and Jesus, peace be upon him. And so all this actually ends up being evidence of the truthfulness of Islam. And I'll discuss why that is more towards the end of the video. I want to read out a quote from Ibn Ishaq on page 90 of his seerah. The translation, he mentions that the Jewish rabbis and the Christian monks and the Arab soothsayers used to speak about the advent of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ even before he was sent and when the time drew near. And the Jews and Christians, they based this on prophecies that they had in the Bible. But as to the Arab soothsayers, they had been visited by shaitans from the jinn with reports which they had secretly overheard before they were prevented from hearing by being pelted with stars. So they had overheard this stuff from the angels. So we'll first look at the account of Heraclius foreseeing the kingdom of the Arabs in a Muslim source, and then we'll turn to non-Muslim sources. So in Bukhari, a story about Heraclius is mentioned. So one day he woke up and he was in a sad mood, and his priests, they asked him, why are you in such a sad mood? And Heraclius mentioned because he was a fortune teller and an astrologer, as is mentioned in the narration. Heraclius said that at night he looked into the stars and he saw that the leader of those who practiced circumcision had appeared. So the people discussed and they said, well, it's the Jews who practice circumcision, so this must be something he foresaw about the Jews. So it's easier, we're just going to unalive all the Jews, so none of the Jews is going to come with a kingdom and conquer your empire. But then, as they were discussing, they eventually realized that Heraclius's this thing he saw through astrology, that it was about the Arab. And so Heraclius ends by remarking that the sovereignty of the Arabs had appeared, and so he clearly knew that the Arab kingdom was coming and it was going to conquer much of what he had. So that's the Muslim source. But as for non-Muslim sources, we see this, for example, in the 4th book of the Chronicle of Fredegar, which is written around 660 CE, mentions the same thing, that Heraclius, he practiced astrology, by which art he discovered, God helping him, that his empire would be laid waste by circumcised races. Heraclius and the people, they assume it's going to be the Jews, so there's an order to force the Jews to be baptized. But then the chronicler goes on to explain that actually what Heraclius foretold was fulfilled through the Arab. So he says the race of Hagars, who were also called Saracens, a circumcised people who of old had lived beneath the Caucasus. Goes on to say, this race had grown so numerous that at last they took up arms and threw themselves upon the provinces of the Emperor Heraclius. And he goes on and he describes how the Saracens constantly defeat the Romans. So he says, for example, that on the following day, at the moment of joining battle, his men saw that so large a part of their force had fallen by divine judgment, they no longer dared advance on the Saracens, but all retired whence they came. The Saracens proceeded, as was their habit, to lay waste the provinces of the empire that had fallen to them. So the chronicler is clearly showing you that the circumcised people who actually came with the kingdom and took over much of Heraclius' kingdom were the Arab. So Sean Anthony, who is an Orientalist, he mentions in his book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, the Making of the Prophet of Islam, ﷺ, he mentions that this so-called legend that we're discussing, of course he thinks it's a legend because Orientalists don't believe in anything supernatural. He says, in fact, appears in an extraordinarily broad range of non-Muslim sources. The story of how Heraclius discerned the coming conquests of the kingdom of the circumcised, whether from astral portents or a dream, appears in chronicles and histories composed in Latin, Georgian, Christian Arabic, translated from Coptic and Syriac, and even Ethiopic. These sources span a wide geographical and chronological range, but of all of them, the Latin accounts stand out as the earliest by far. Now, regarding the chronicle we've been looking at, Sean Anthony further adds, the mid-7th century provenance of this Merovingian chronicle places the genesis of the Heraclius legend at an extraordinarily early date, slightly more than 2 decades after the emperor's death. One must push the provenance of the legend even further back chronologically, inasmuch as the Latin chronicler draws upon an earlier Eastern source. And he also adds, the earliest extant manuscript of Fredegar's chronicle, which dates from circa 715 to 716 CE, includes the story, so the legend cannot be a later interpolation. Now, this is very significant for us because it means that we have a source here, this chronicle, which is very, very early, and even it is drawing upon an even earlier source. And we have a manuscript of this source, which is very, very early. And so all of this lends a lot of credibility to this incident being historical. Now, of course, Sean Anthony, being an Orientalist, they don't believe in supernatural events, is not going to at all speculate whether this could actually be historical. But as for us who don't a priori rule out anything supernatural, these facts lend a lot of credibility to it being historical. Similarly, Robert G. Hoyland mentions in his book Seeing Islam as Other Side, again another Orientalist, he gives a bit of a translation of the Byzantine and Arab Chronicle of 741 and its Eastern source. So the translation goes as follows. The Saracens, in rebellion and hostility to the provinces of the Romans, they started attacking them. And Theodore, the brother of the Emperor Heraclius, fought many battles against them. On hearing the report, Heraclius warned his brother that he should in no way fight with such people, for indeed he was experienced in the knowledge of the discipline of astrology, and should anything happen by chance, he would know somehow. So clearly, Heraclius knew not to fight them, because he knew from astrology that they were going to come and conquer the Romans. Now in the footnote here, Hoyland adds yet another source that also mentions Heraclius' astrological prediction. That's the Chronicle of 754. I believe that Hoyland thinks that these two chronicles are drawing upon a common Eastern source. So Hoyland mentions that the Chronicle of 754 begins the same, but continues. Theodore withdrew from combat to increase and consolidate his forces for war at the admonition of his brother, who was mindful of the prophecy of the rats. And then Hoyland comments, Heraclius' astrological prediction about the Arabs is recorded by a variety of sources. Now regarding the chronicler describing it as the prophecy of the rats, he's describing it in his own words in this way because he is a Christian who's biased against the Muslims, so he wants to throw an insult out there calling them rats because that's how he sees the Muslims, as a biased Christian. And Hoyland himself mentions that whereas the Chronicle of 741 simply relays the Eastern source, abbreviating but not polemicizing, the Chronicle of 754 often adds a pejorative remark or omits the notice altogether if it is too positive, as with that on Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. So the chronicler of 754 is biased against the Muslims, so sometimes he adds insults out there describing things in a way that would further his anti-Muslim agenda. Another point in favor of the historicity of the story is that we have other evidence showing us that Heraclius was very interested in astrology, as mentioned by Stefan Esters. Now, it's important to mention that we Muslims don't actually believe in astrology. We believe that they are liars. As the Prophet ﷺ mentions, whoever learns about the stars, he learns a branch of magic. And we know that magic is from the devils, so astrology is from the devils. So because we don't believe astrologers and we believe they're liars, the question becomes, how do they sometimes get things right? Well, there are one of two reasons. Number one, it's a coincidence. And number two, they've learned it from the devil. So how do the devils learn this stuff? Well, sometimes they learn stuff by overhearing the angels talking about it. And so they come and they report this to the soothsayer, or they show it to an astrologer. And typically they are mixed with a bunch of lies as well. But we do know from the seerah that there were soothsayers who were foretelling the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, because they had learned this from the jinn, who had learned it from the angels. So if we return to Bukhari, we see that Heraclius not only knew that the Prophet ﷺ was going to come out based on astrology, but he also knew it from the Bible. He mentions that if what you have said is true, he will very soon occupy this place underneath my feet. And I knew it that he was going to appear, but I did not know that he would be from among you. If I could reach him, definitely I would go immediately to meet him, and if I were with him, I would certainly wash his feet. So Heraclius knew from the prophecies in the Torah and Gospel that the Prophet ﷺ was going to come out. And he says that he is going to occupy the very land beneath my feet. And of course, the Muslims did conquer the land, Jerusalem, where Heraclius said this. Now, there are other people who also foresaw through astrology or soothsaying the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, as is mentioned in Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, and he mentions a number of these narrations. I'm going to mention two of them to you that have to do with astrology. So Hassan bin Thabit said, "By Allah, I was a lad of 7 years or 8 years old. I had not reached maturity, but capable of understanding all that I saw and heard. And I heard a Jew shouting at the top of his voice, in Atma, in Yathrib, saying, "O group of Jews," till they gathered around him and said, "Woe to you, what is the matter?" And he said, "Tonight the star of Ahmed has risen," indicating his birth. And this is mentioned on page 70 of Ibn Ishaq, and Shaykh al-Albani says this is Hassan. Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufail also mentions that a rabbi from the rabbis of Syria informed me, "Prophet has emerged or will soon emerge in your land as the star of his emergence has appeared. To return to your land and believe in him and follow him." And this is also authentic. Now these stories are supernatural and hence they indicate the truth of Islam, but they also show you that the story of the Prophet ﷺ is similar to the story of Musa ﷺ, and it also has parallels with the story of Jesus, peace be upon him. So let's begin with the parallels to the life of Moses, peace be upon him, in relation to this story about being foretold by astrologers. And the clearest parallel here is actually with the story of Heraclius that we've been looking at. So first, a bit of background so we can properly appreciate this. So the Egyptians and Pharaoh, they had been enslaving the children of Israel and they had been oppressing them. Then Pharaoh started to unalive the baby boys born to the children of Israel. The question is, why was Pharaoh unaliving them? Well, according to an ancient Jewish tradition, which is recorded in, for example, Josephus, the astrologers of Pharaoh foresaw that the leader of the children of Israel was going to be born. He was going to redeem the children of Israel, and he was going to bring the Egyptian dominion low. So in order to escape his fate and prevent this, Pharaoh ordered that the baby boys from Bani Israel should be unalived. But ironically, the very child that he had wanted to unalive, the one who would grow up to be the redeemer of Israel, that very child was put into a basket, put into water, and ended up being taken by Pharaoh's own family and spared directly by Pharaoh and brought up in Pharaoh's own household. What a wonderful irony. And a lot of the elements here, they may not be miraculous, but they show you God's planning, as Josephus himself notes, and they show you that God was with Moses. So Musa ﷺ ends up being raised in Pharaoh's own household, and he ended up being the figure that redeemed Bani Israel from their Egyptian oppressors, and he led them back into the land of Canaan, the land of their forefathers. And Pharaoh and his armies, they were punished by God. The slaves, Bani Israel, defeated their oppressors. And although Pharaoh tried to escape his fate, God planned it in such a way that he was unable to escape his fate. So how does the story of Heraclius end up paralleling all of this? Well, the Romans for 500 years had been oppressing Bani Israel by the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So they were the Egyptians of their time. They had destroyed the temple of the Jews and they had exiled them. And Heraclius himself, he continued the Roman oppression of the Jews. There are even reports that he massacred the Jewish population after his retaking of Jerusalem from the Persians, and he expelled the Jews. Now, just like Pharaoh's astrologers foresaw that the leader of Bani Israel was going to arise and bring down the Egyptian dominion, Heraclius, as an astrologer, foresaw that the kingdom of the circumcised would arise and it would conquer Roman lands. Now, just like Pharaoh tried to avoid his fate by issuing a decree that the baby boys of Bani Israel should be unalived, Heraclius tried to avoid his fate by decreeing that the Jews of his kingdom should be forcefully baptized. And this is mentioned in the Chronicle of Fredegar, again written around 660 CE, as well as in the History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, which is compiled in the 10th century. But this particular section, as Robert Hoyland mentions, is probably relying on a 7th century source. But just like Pharaoh, Heraclius was unable to avoid his fate. The circumcised nation ended up being the Arabs, not the Jews. And Heraclius himself had realized this at some point. Perhaps he realized this during the initial discussions, as is mentioned in Bukhari. Perhaps he realized this later. But regardless, he did realize this at some point. So even if he figured out that it was going to be the Arabs early on, perhaps he wanted to be safe, and that's why he ordered that the Jews should be forcefully baptized. So anyway, the circumcised Arabs do end up conquering Roman territory in an amazing way. The small Arab armies end up defeating the massive armies of Persia and Rome. And God punishes the Roman armies through the Arabs, just like he punished Pharaoh with the coming of Musa ﷺ. And the slaves ended up defeating the people in power, the Egyptians. All of this paralleling of the life of Musa ﷺ, it shows divine planning. The Muslims freed the Jews from Heraclius' reign. They cleansed the temple and they allowed Jews back into Jerusalem, just like how Musa ﷺ saved Bani Israel from slavery and brought them back into the land. At this point, I want to make a couple of important notes. First of all, in addition to the two sources we already looked at that say Heraclius was ordering the forced baptism of the Jews due to his vision, we also know from the writing called Teaching of Jacob Newly Baptized, which is written around 634 CE, that Heraclius was indeed ordering the forced baptism of the Jews around this time. And this is also mentioned by Maximus the Confessor, who also says that around this time, Heraclius sent out a decree for the forced baptism of Jews and Samaritans. Now, these two sources don't link it to Heraclius having a vision of the circumcised people, but they are evidence that around this time, around the relevant time, Heraclius did in fact make this decree of the forced baptism of the Jews. Another interesting note is that according to the Talmud, the astrologers of Pharaoh actually misunderstood the vision that they saw. According to this Talmudic tradition, the astrologers of Pharaoh saw that the leader of Israel would be struck in water, and hence there was this decree to drown the babies of Bani Israel. But actually what they saw was referring to Musa alayhi salam being struck at the waters of Meribah, which is a story in the Bible. So the astrologers of Pharaoh misunderstood what they saw, and that's why there was this decree of the babies of Bani Israel being drowned. And this is similar to Heraclius at first misunderstanding what he saw through astrology. He assumed that the circumcised nation that he saw was referring to the Jews, but actually it was referring to the Arabs. And because he misunderstood what he saw, that's why he ordered the forced baptism of the Jews. And even if he later realized that it was referring to the Arabs, it seems he still forcefully baptized them, perhaps to be safe. But this is another very clear parallel, the fact that both the astrologers of Pharaoh and Heraclius, the astrologer, misunderstood what they saw. So these parallels to the life of Musa alayhi salam, they show divine planning. It shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is setting up the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam's mission to be similar to that of Musa alayhi salam. These parallels cannot be chalked up to coincidence. Just like Musa alayhi salam being put in the water, surviving, and being raised in Pharaoh's own house is not a coincidence. It shows divine planning. Similarly, these parallels to the life of Musa alayhi salam cannot be a coincidence. They show divine planning. So that's with regards to the parallels with the life of Musa alayhi salam. What about the parallels with regards to Jesus, peace be upon him? Well, here the other two narrations we looked at come in. Remember, in one of the narrations, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is born, and a Jew sees a star indicating the birth of a new prophet. And in the other narration, a rabbi from Sham mentions that a star has arisen indicating the appearance of a new prophet. Well, this is all similar to something we find in the Gospel of Matthew, according to which when Jesus was born, there were Gentiles who saw a star in the east, and they interpreted this star as indicating the birth of the King of the Jews. So just like at the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, according to Matthew, there were Gentiles who saw a star indicating the birth of the Messiah. There were Jews at the time of the Prophet ﷺ who saw a star, and they said this indicates the birth of a new prophet. Now, at this point, I want to make a note that although the version of the infancy narrative we find in Matthew is different from the infancy narrative we find in the Quran, that doesn't mean there can't be certain details about the infancy narrative in Matthew that are based on something that actually happened historically. So this detail, something like that could have happened, it's not a problem. Now, the rest of the story is similar to the story of Musa alayhi salam, as well as the story of Heraclius and the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam as well, because in it, the Gentiles, they actually tell Herod that they've seen the star of the Messiah, and Herod, who was ruling Judea at the time, is afraid, so he eventually makes a decree that the children of Bani Israel should be unalived. But an angel warns Joseph of this and tells him to flee to Egypt with Jesus, and so Jesus is able to, alayhi salam, avoid this decree. Still, I don't want to stress this parallel too much because modern scholars, basically a lot of them, don't believe that this story in the Gospel of Matthew is historical. That being said, the detail about them seeing a star and associating it with the birth of the King Messiah, something like this could have actually happened historically. And even the International Critical Commentary says something similar. It says that Christians at the time could have actually seen an astrological phenomenon that actually happened and then retrospectively associated it with the birth of Jesus. So something like this could have actually happened. Now, at the end here, I just want to go over a number of benefits that we can derive from our discussion today. First of all, the fact that the story in the Hadith corpus about Heraclius foreseeing the rise of the circumcised nation, the fact that this is there also in early non-Muslim sources, this lends credibility to the Hadith corpus and the Isnad system. Number two, the fact that the Heraclius story is found in early non-Muslim sources, it lends credibility to the other narrations in the Sirah about soothsayers and astrologers knowing that a prophet was going to come out. Number 3, these narrations are examples of supernatural events occurring in relation to the Prophet ﷺ, which indicate his prophetic status. The fact that you had a number of supernatural events occurring in relation to him shows he's a prophet. Number 4, the fact that before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ and before his kingdom's rise, you had this expectation building up of his coming, which he fulfilled by astrologers, soothsayers, but also by biblical prophecies. This all shows you the importance of the coming of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. Another benefit we can derive is that the Jews saw a star indicating the birth of a prophet. And of course, this shows you that Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam was a true prophet because he is the prophet who came at that time. Now, regarding the narration of Heraclius by itself, it is still supporting evidence that adds to the cumulative case that demonstrates that Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam was a true prophet. Why is it evidence? Why is it supporting evidence? Because it is still a supernatural prediction that came true. So for Christians to contextualize this, imagine if before Jesus was born, there was an astrologer who foresaw that a man named Jesus was going to come, he was going to claim to be the Messiah, and he was going to be crucified. Of course, the Christians would take that very seriously. Now, the reason I said that what Heraclius foresaw is supporting evidence is because Heraclius didn't see them as the nation of God. He saw them as a circumcised people. This is different from what the Jews saw, because the star that they saw, they interpreted as a star of the coming of a prophet. Still, what Heraclius saw did include a clue that the nation would be God's people, because Heraclius saw them as circumcised, which is a positive trait of the Arabs. And not only is it a positive trait, but it highlights their relationship to God, because of course the reason Arabs would circumcise themselves is because, as Genesis 17 mentions, God commanded Abraham to circumcise himself, his household, and Ishmael. So the children of Ishmael continued this tradition by circumcising themselves. So the fact that Heraclius saw this trait of the Arabs, a trait which ultimately goes back to their relationship with God and Abraham, it is an indication that the nation that was going to come out would be God's people. Now, another benefit we can derive is the fact that the Prophet ﷺ being foretold before his birth by these astrologers, soothsayers, etc., and his rise being foretold. This means that his story fits into the pattern established by the fact that Moses and Jesus were also foretold through astrology. And just like how the Gentiles seeing a heavenly sign of Jesus' birth indicates the importance of his birth, and the astrologers of Pharaoh foreseeing the birth of Moses, that indicates the importance of Moses' birth, Heraclius and the others foreseeing the coming of the Prophet ﷺ establishes the importance of his coming as well. And finally, the fact that the Heraclius astrology story and the Romans oppressing Bani Israel until the Muslims came, the fact that this is so closely paralleled in the story of Moses and Pharaoh and the astrologers of Pharaoh shows you that the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, it has been divinely planned. It cannot be chalked up to coincidence, especially when you consider the fact that Moses himself was told about a prophet to come in the future who was going to be like him.